Verse of the day for Wednesday, the 19th of April, 2023. We're in Matthew chapter 18, and today is verse 33. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? Who's saying that? Is this Jesus speaking to us? Well, yes, it is. It's Jesus speaking to his disciples, but he's telling a parable, and in this parable, a king is telling this to a wicked servant. So this parable was prompted by a question from Peter to Jesus. Peter asks, how many times am I supposed to forgive my brother when he sins against me? He asks 7 times? And Jesus says, no, not 7 times, 70 times 7. And Peter does some math, and he comes up with 490, and he goes, there's no way I can ever keep track of that. And Jesus says, exactly. So then Jesus tells the parable of the 10,000 talent debt. The parable begins with a phrase, the kingdom of heaven is like unto, as many of his parables do. The kingdom of heaven is like unto the king, like a king who takes account of his servants. While he's taking account of his servants, he finds out that one of his servants owes him 10,000 talents. Now, apparently, 10,000 was the largest unit of measurement in the time of in Jesus' time. And talents are the largest unit of currency. So this is like, Jesus is basically saying, oh yeah, he owes a gajillion $1,000 bills, right? And actually, I think it works out to more like $1 billion. But in his time, this was the biggest number he could think of. In our time, $1 billion is not the biggest number that we can think of when it comes to money. So the servant owes $1 billion or a gajillion dollars to his king. How does this happen? Who knows? The king commands that the servant and his whole family be sold into slavery, and that everything he owns, that the servant owns, be sold to pay toward this debt. Obviously, he's not going to have enough to pay the whole debt. But that's how debt payment works sometimes, is you pay everything you possibly can. The servant got down on his knees and worshipped the king and begged for patience. He said he will pay the whole debt. The servant will pay the whole debt if the king can just have patience with him. Instead, the king forgives his debt. So the servant goes along. Can you imagine how he's feeling, having his 10,000 talent debt forgiven? If I owed somebody $1 billion and they forgave my debt, or if you did, how would you feel? Well, I don't know how he feels, but his actions are somewhat surprising. He goes to a fellow servant. This fellow servant owed him 100 pence, which sounds like $1, right? But I've heard somewhere else that 1 pence is 1 day's wages in those times. So he owes him about 3 months of wages. Still, compared to $1 billion, that's not a lot, is it? And he takes the fellow servant by the neck and shakes him and says, give me the money that you owe me. And the fellow servant begs him and says, I don't have the money now. Please be patient with me and I will pay. And the wicked servant gets the fellow servant cast into prison until he can pay the debt, the 100 pence debt. So some other fellow servants see what happens and they tell the king. And the king, of course, calls the wicked servant to him. And this is what he says. He says, I forgave your debt. Shouldest not thou also have had compassion on thy fellow servant, even as I had pity on thee? So that's the whole parable. Who is the king in this parable? Well, Jesus is the king in this parable. Or maybe Heavenly Father is the king, but Jesus is the judge. And I wanted to share just a couple verses for that, to show that Jesus is the judge. From John chapter 5, verse 22, for the Father judgeth no man, but hath committed all judgment unto the Son. Verse 27, and hath given him authority to execute judgment also, because he is the Son of Man. I love that verse because that reminds us that Jesus it informs us that Jesus is judging us, and it reminds us that that's because he has been one of us. He knows what we go through. And then verse 30, I can of mine own self do nothing. As I hear, I judge. And my judgment is just, because I seek not mine own will, but the will of the Father which hath sent me. Another reminder from Jesus that he is here to do his Father's will. And he promises us that his judgment will be just. He will be merciful, but he will be just. So who is the wicked servant in this story? All of us are the wicked servant. I'm the wicked servant. You're the wicked servant. Who is the fellow servant? The fellow servant is my neighbor. To me, the fellow servant is you. To you, the fellow servant is everyone else. Jesus told us that the second great commandment is to love our neighbor as ourselves. After the first great commandment, which is to love God. And then, and then here's one example of him telling us that we are commanded to forgive others. From Mark chapter 11, verse 25 and 26. And when ye stand praying, forgive, if ye have aught against any, that your Father also which is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. But if ye do not forgive, neither will your Father which is in heaven forgive your trespasses. That's just one example of Jesus telling us we have to forgive others. What is the debt in the story? It's our sin, it's our trespasses, right? So what do we owe Heavenly Father? We owe him our obedience from the beginning. And we are not always obedient, and so we owe him a debt. And that's what we call trespasses or sins. So, I know that was only one verse, and we ended up hearing about a whole parable. Funny how that works sometimes. Have a great day. I hope you enjoyed the verse of the day and this little video.